Evening, everyone. Joining me, Elliot Grigg, with my esteemed co-colleague Daniel. We're going to talk about the Eubank Smith preview the fight that's coming up coming up shortly at the Manchester Arena. It's obviously a massive all-British fight taking place in the middleweight. Well, it's a middleweight division. Obviously, Smith has campaigned down at super welter for a while, but this fight's taking place at middleweight. We're going to take you guys through that, preview it on the SBR Boxing channel. But first and foremost, before we step into it, I'm going to come to you, Danny, and just say, how are you doing, sir? How are you this evening?
That's so considerate of you, mate. You know, people always just going straight into the boxing, but this is what makes ESBR boxing different from camaraderie. No, all good. As I say, just in from being stuck in traffic, so wasn't actually sure we would get to record this, but delighted to be here, delighted to be speaking to you. Unreal fight. I'm really looking forward to discussing it.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this one as well. It's almost let's just jump in. Obviously, I mentioned it there in the introduction about the sort of weights. Obviously, I'll give a bit of a breakdown before we go into it, but then we can talk about that. So obviously, Liam Smith, 32-3-1. He's 34 years old, which is going to be quite surprising when I also tell you that Eubank is 33, so only a year older than Eubank, which is surprising to some fans there. Obviously, he's got victories. He's been a previous world champion, obviously, WBO champion. Has been in there, obviously, the likes of Canelo, Liam Williams, Munguia, Eggington. Who was when the sort of comeback started in 2019. But yeah, so his losses, obviously the three losses I was talking about there are to Korbanov, which was recently in 2021, which was a points loss over in Russia. Some said it was a close fight. Could really have gone Smith's way, quite frankly. The loss was to Munguia. That was back in 2018. That was also a UD loss, and the only other loss that he had was stoppage by Canelo in the 9th round of their 2016 fight. So looking at that, other British names you might recognise on his record: Anthony Fowler, 2021. But obviously Eubank could be a massive British scalp if he manages to get through that. Chris Eubank himself comes into this 32-2, 23 KOs. Like I said, 33 years old, so actually older and has been almost around longer than in some ways people seem to think with Eubank. Obviously, kind of consider it as, in many ways, some people still see him as a prospect, myself included. But he's been in there with obviously the likes of Liam Smith recently, came through a UD win there. De Gale beat De Gale, obviously, back in 2019. Obviously, beyond his peak, James De Gale. I think that's very fair to say and correct to say. Obviously, George Groves, that was in the WBSS Super Series, lost that fight back in 2018, UD loss. Other names on his record are Nick Blackwell, Gary O'Sullivan, and obviously Billy Joe Saunders, who he lost split decision to back in 2014. So there's a lot of names there, Danny, aren't there, that we sort of recognise. I said we're going to talk about weight, but actually what we're going to first talk about is just who you think actually at this stage, quite similar records, similar ages, who's got the better record for you at this point in time?
Ooh. Depends how you... Because like people chat about resume, and then people going about how Derek Chisora's resume, but you know what I mean. So you probably have to say overall that Eubank's been in with a better opposition in terms of depth. I would say obviously the Canelo fight for Smith is like the standout name on either of them. But you look going in with Groves. I mean, faded De Gale, but De Gale nonetheless. Obviously Billy Joe Saunders very early on. You know, I think there's probably more depth. I mean, you look at the Liam Williams. Is that Eubank's best wins? Would you probably say De Gale? I would say Eubank's probably been in there with a better opposition overall in terms of depth. And saying that, you know, Canelo, Munguia, the jury's still out with him. Fowler, a good win. Jesse Vargas, a good win. So it's tricky. Obviously, Liam Smith beat Liam Williams himself. So, it is close, you know. It is close. I know I said Eubank Jr. I would probably edge. I think the Saunders and Groves, factoring in De Gale, you know, obviously as we said, past his best, probably just edge out Smith's, in my opinion. I know Canelo, as I say, is the standout one, but I would say Eubank Jr. here. Just fucking stop the waffling.
Yeah, no, I'd actually agree with you. I feel like with Liam Smith, I thought when you're putting him with the likes of sort of Fowler, even that's a sort of British fight, obviously in the northwest area, it was massive sort of local interest. I almost feel like you're almost looking at him declining, and he's almost sort of going back up a bit now. You're sort of thinking, actually, hold on, if he beats Eubank here, they could be on the cusp of another sort of big fight. But taking on the weights, and as I was saying, so obviously Eubank's fought this fight's at middleweight. Eubank's fought at middleweight. Frequently, he's fought up at super middle as well. Whereas Liam Smith's obviously been fighting more at sort of junior middleweight, super welterweight. Weight. Do you think Liam Smith here comes in as 5'9.5"? Eubank 5'11"? Do you feel like, without wishing to potentially give away your prediction at this stage, do you feel like the weight is going to make a difference in this size and weight advantage possibly for Eubank, or do you think it's negligible given the sort of close range?
No, I don't think there's much in it at all, size wise. I think Smith's probably ever so slightly broader. I don't even know if those heights are that accurate. I think it's probably less in it than an inch and a half. And Smith's style is probably suited more to fighting, taller fighters. He didn't do well against Munguia, but Canelo, slightly smaller fighters. So I think, from what I understand, Eubank, doesn't cut a whole lot of weight. I think they'll probably quite similar weights in there, to be honest with you. So no, I don't think the weight will be the deciding factor in this one, or height or size or anything like that.
Let's touch on the style that you mentioned it briefly. With Eubank, I feel like there's almost been two different Chris Eubank Juniors. There's obviously the early Eubank that was almost just constant kind of uppercuts, it's like a ridiculous engine, and kind of had a sort of vicious spite to his work, which seems to almost have been chiseled out a bit. It reminds me of kind of Wayne Rooney when he used to shoot from range, and then like someone got into him, and then all of a sudden like get around the 20-yard area and just start passing it left and right. And you feel like since he sort of teamed up either with Roy Jones, or even maybe a bit before that, possibly, I don't know, with obviously the injury that Blackwell had, maybe that played on his mind a bit. But he almost seems to have like refined himself, or wanting to refine himself into more of a boxer. Smith, obviously, his style hasn't really changed much. Obviously, we've seen him kind of competent boxing in a lot of ways. Do you think stylistically this will make for a good fight? And do you feel that Eubank under Roy Jones Jr., that style will benefit him here? Or do you reckon the earlier Eubank would have been a better chance of victory?
Oh, I think the style he's trying to implement, or has been trying to implement under Roy Jones, I'm not saying if it was Roy Jones Jr. he would win. That's obviously ridiculous, but sort of a more effective version, I think, would be a good style to beat Liam Smith. But I haven't been convinced with this new Eubank Jr., to be honest with you. Obviously, the Marcus Morrison fight, points win, claimed that was intentional to get the rounds. And the Liam Williams fight, I just thought was strange. He knocked Williams, seemed to have had so much taken out of him from that Andrade fight, and was getting floored and rocked by jabs. And Eubank's never been known as a puncher. So, and then it seemed as if he had Williams on the brink of a stoppage from so early on, and then let Williams back into the extent where you were sort of thinking this could be quite close here. I think there's rumours that he started to suffer quite a lot of hand injuries, Eubank, and I think it's too late in the career for him to become that good enough on the back foot to stop someone who is, I think it's quite fair to say, at one point it was a world-class pressure fighter in Liam Smith. So I know we're going to get into predictions, I'm sure quite soon, but I think Smith will probably fancy the job here. As I know, I mentioned the knockdowns that Eubank scored against Williams, but I still don't think he's got necessarily the power. He's got power to make Smith think about his work, but I don't think hit him with something to think that'll make him stop coming forward. And it's an interesting clash of styles. I think at one point Eubank will have to revert to type, I think, and then it'll really take fire, I think.
Do you think, just a bit of a curveball here, obviously Liam Smith has been a world champion. Do you think Eubank at this stage of his career is failed potential, or do you think that there's still enough to come? Because I feel like 33, we've been talking about Eubank as sort of breaking through for a while, and it hasn't necessarily happened. And I'm just wondering whether you think that there's essentially, he hasn't lived up to the hype, or that he won't be able to live up to the hype, or do you think that there's obviously a lot more to come from him?
See, I was going to say, when you first asked the question, I started thinking there, I was going to say, no, he's not failed potential, because I think he's done quite well with his ability. But then you think, right, he's so athletic, he's really quick, he's got an unbelievable engine, and he's got a really, really good chin. And you think, because I know we had Ronnie Davis, but he seemed to be sort of training himself, or his dad was being in. And I know Ronnie Davis done great work in his dad, but I'm not sure how much he was actually training you. But and you wonder if like a real world-class trainer had got him from like 24, 25, with the attributes I mentioned, and how good he could have been. Because it just seemed that like he would flatten a certain level of opposition. Obviously, the Gildred knockout was great. Touched on, I sort of passed it to Gale, Liam Williams, and then the Nick Blackwell's, as you say. But it just seemed anyone with, decent footwork and a really good jab was too much for him. We mentioned Billy Joe Saunders, George Groves. Obviously, there's a big size disadvantage there. But I would probably say yes. I think with a better trainer, Eubank had the attributes to be probably a world-class fighter. And I don't know if he ever has been a world-class fighter. I don't know what win you look at in that CV and you think, yeah, that makes you definitely world-class. So yeah, probably is a case of slight field potential. But obviously he's made a fucking, absolute fortune of money. And if you look at fighters who, are the sons of other, famous fighters, he's probably done the best, I would say. So
yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's hard because we're almost like we're looking for that victory where you go, oh yeah, you actually are world class, rather than kind of you've equipped yourself well against sort of world class fighters, but you still lost. But just before we're gonna, well, I'm gonna ask you for a prediction before we go. But before we do that, I'm gonna take kind of both men in the kind of divisions I suppose that they're campaigning more in. So if we look at, we'll start with Eubank because we've been talking about him. But if we start looking at him, obviously in that middleweight division, do you think? Obviously, there's champions, Zanibek up there, Golovkin, Charlo, whoever knows what's happening with him. Do you think there's a world title in that division for Eubank Jr. before he retires, or do you think where he is beyond this, it's still unlikely that he'll ever realise it in that division?
This might sound a bit strange because I've just, said how he was never world class, but I think Golovkin could be there for the picking at the minute. Honestly, I think he looked such a shadow of his former self in that Canelo the trilogy fight, and I think even Canelo looked like he had regressed and yet still won that fight. The most convincingly of the three by far. I think Murata hurt him multiple times to the body. I think Golovkin looked really concerned about what was coming back and almost looked content to go the distance. He opened up a bit in the last two rounds, but looked like a fighter who was well aware that the punch resistance maybe wasn't what it was, and certainly there was vulnerabilities to the body. Whether Eubank in this new style is the man to sort of capitalise and swoop in and, have that change in the guard fight, I'm not sure. But I think that's probably the most winnable one. I think he's got no chance against Charlo, to be honest. I think at this stage, I know it's the lesser of the two Charlos, but I still think he'd be too athletic for him and too fundamentally good for him. And then I would favour Janibek against them too. I know he didn't really impress the way we thought he would against Denzel Bentley recently. But I don't think he ever got out of second gear, and I've said since that fight that a lot of times you'll see these fighters who are like really skilled but don't have the name value. Put in maybe a performance. You saw Usyk against Chisora. I don't think Joshua would have took that fight if he had hadn't made it. I don't think it was as close as some people thought, but if he went in there and stopped Chisora in 4 or 5 rounds, so I wouldn't rule out that. But I think the Golovkin one is the most winnable one, which is a remarkable thing to say because I don't think that would be the outcome if he found his pen 7-8 years ago.
That's very true. I think just obviously we're gonna have to caveat, but there's a significant proportion of boxing media, Danny, that still think Chisora actually won that fight against Usyk. But we'll move on from that now, and we'll say
what you like, Elliot. It's what you like.
And we'll go into Liam Smith, obviously going down to that super welter division. Obviously, Smith's ranked second for the, like you say, the finer of the Charlo brothers WBO title. Do you see Smith being able to sort of, obviously, this division that also involves the likes of Castano, Fundora, Tim Tszyu is also coming through in that division as well. Do you think Liam Smith at 34 has got what it takes for another title in that division, or do you think he's summited it once and that's the sort of peak that he will be summiting on a world level?
Well, if Charlo, retains all 4 belts, and it looks as if that's sort of his intention, I think he's quite content to play all the sort of sanctioned fees. Then no, categorically, there's just levels. He was the vacate, and at Smith very well ranked. Who's to say who one of those shots could come against? I'd favour the likes of Tim Tszyu to beat him. I'd favour Fundora to beat him. Outside of that, there's not a great deal at 154. Castano, probably a bit too much in that. But outside of that, he's well ranked with a few governing bodies. So I think it's not beyond the realms of possibilities. Says he had a good 2022, definitely. But I think, if he beats Eubank Jr., that rematch is probably going to be most likely. Obviously, that clause is there. So, and then at that stage, you're sort of thinking how much ambition's left. He'll probably be, 35 by the time that comes around. So I think he's definitely capable of winning another world title should the right belt and the right opponent present itself. But I just don't know how likely a sequence of events unfolds, that would be necessary to make that happen is.
No, I fully agree with you. But I'm now going to have to, Danny, because obviously we talked about what could potentially happen both these guys down the line. I'm going to have to press you gently and slightly for a prediction here on this one. How do you see it going? Like we said, it's close in records, close in resumes, close in physical stats. How do you see this one going? Do you see it being a stoppage or points first? And either way, who do you have winning it, please?
It's a really close fight, you know. I think because Liam Smith is a slow starter, so it sort of depends, you know, how many of those early rounds Eubank can bank. Because I think I could see Smith taking over, you know, in the second half. And I don't think he would stop Eubank Jr. He's referenced in interviews that through their sparring he can be hurt to the body. But, you know, we've not seen evidence to suggest that, so you can only go off what, you know, you've seen personally, I think. But I think the fight's closer than the odds suggest. You know, they've got Eubank a sort of clear favourite. But, you know, gun to my head, in Liverpool, this new style that Eubank's adopted, I think Smith could maybe bank, you know, enough of the rounds to get it, to edge it. So I'd probably edge Liam Smith at this stage. That's subject to change.
You know, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm not going to agree with you. I'm really struggling to call it. I think it will be points either way, to be perfectly honest. I think it worried me a bit. Eubank Williams worried me a bit because obviously, like you say, he put it on him early and then just faded away in the second half of the fight. And you're going, am I still watching the same contest that I saw for the first sort of 5 rounds of this? And I think, like you say, if that happens against Smith's canny enough to bank rounds as well. So I can see it being a close fight. It's a hell of a fight. Weirdly, I am actually almost leaning towards Smith as well. I just wonder whether, there'll be some sort of judging whether the money or the investment is in Eubank winning potentially for super fights. But I actually think that Smith on points is actually probably the way I'm leaning currently. But again, subject to change. But I want to first off say thank you very much, everyone, for watching this. Thank you very much, Danny, obviously, for joining me in what proves to be a great event, obviously, in the Manchester Arena on the 21st of January. And we'll see which way it shakes out. Obviously, like Danny has said previously in the fine comparing work that he's been doing, if you feel like we're talking rubbish, please do comment. There'll be other stuff. Obviously, leave your comments on who you think is going to win. We'll have other content obviously coming out. There'll be written previews. There'll be interviews coming out fight week and all that sort of business. But all that really leaves me to say is again, thank you, Danny, and thank you guys for watching.